The wind howled across the flat, open plains of Wyoming, carrying with it a biting chill that cut through even the thickest coats. The sky was painted in shades of gray, heavy clouds pressing down on the landscape like an invisible weight. Snowflakes swirled wildly in the air, blanketing everything they touched in a thick layer of white. It was the kind of blizzard that made people stay indoors, huddled close to their heaters, praying for the storm to pass. In the middle of this desolate stretch of highway stood Maggie's Diner, a small but welcoming place that had become a lifeline for travelers passing through. Its neon sign flickered faintly against the stormy backdrop, the words Maggie's Diner glowing dimly in red and yellow letters. Inside, the warmth of the diner contrasted sharply with the freezing world outside. The smell of coffee brewing filled the air, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked pies and sizzling bacon. Maggie Carter moved around the diner with practiced ease, her steps light despite the long hours she'd already put in that day. She was a woman in her late 40s with warm brown skin and curly black hair, pulled back into a loose bun. Her smile came easily, lighting up her face and making everyone feel instantly at home. Maggie had owned the diner for nearly 10 years, ever since she left Chicago to start anew. Running the diner wasn't always easy, especially in such a remote location, but she loved it. To her, it wasn't just a business, it was a place where people could find comfort, even if only for a short while. That evening, as the storm outside grew worse, Maggie noticed headlights approaching through the swirling snow. At first, she thought it might be one of the regulars, a trucker or two stopping by for dinner before heading off again. But then more vehicles appeared, their taillights blinking like fireflies in the darkness. One by one, they pulled into the parking lot, tires crunching over the icy ground. By the time the last truck came to a stop, there were 10 of them lined up outside, their engines idling as if unsure whether to keep going or stay put. Maggie stepped out onto the porch to see what was happening. The cold hit her immediately, stealing her breath for a moment. Pulling her coat tighter around herself, she waved at the drivers, motioning for them to come inside. "You folks better get out of this weather," she called out, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. The first to respond was a tall man with a scruffy beard and a worn leather jacket. His name was Paul, and he introduced himself with a grateful nod. "Thanks, ma'am," he said, stomping his boots on the wooden steps before stepping inside. Behind him came the others: Steve, a younger guy with a baseball cap; Rachel, a slender woman with sharp features and a no-nonsense attitude; Brian, who looked like he hadn't slept in days; Karen, whose bright red scarf stood out against the dreary scene; Joe, an older man with a deep voice and a kind smile; Larry, who carried a toolbox under his arm; Angela, quiet but observant; Chris, who seemed nervous about something; and Danny, the youngest of the group, barely old enough to grow a proper beard. They filed into the diner one by one, shaking off snow and stamping their feet to ward off the cold. Maggie greeted each of them warmly, directing them toward empty booths and offering cups of hot coffee. "Looks like you all picked a real bad night to be out on the road," she said, glancing toward the window where the storm showed no signs of letting up. Paul nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "We were trying to make it to Casper before the worst of it hit, but the roads got too dangerous. Couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Figured we'd pull over here until things calmed down." Maggie listened intently, her expression thoughtful. She knew these highways well. They could be treacherous even on clear days, let alone during a blizzard. Turning back to the kitchen, she began pulling ingredients from the pantry: flour, canned goods, dried beans, potatoes, anything she could use to stretch her supplies. With so many unexpected guests, she'd need to make every bit count. As she worked, the truckers settled in, their conversations filling the diner with a low hum of voices. Rachel sat near the counter, scrolling through her phone, though the signal kept dropping in and out. Steve played cards with Danny, laughing whenever someone made a mistake. Joe and Larry discussed engine troubles, while Angela sketched in a small notebook, occasionally glancing up to study the room. Karen wrapped her hands around her mug, staring out the window as if willing the storm to end. Maggie watched them all, noting the exhaustion etched on their faces and the tension in their shoulders. These weren't just random strangers. They were people with lives and responsibilities. Caught off guard by forces beyond their control, she felt a pang of sympathy, knowing how hard it must be to spend so much time away from home, braving the elements day after day. By the time she finished cooking, the scent of stew wafted through the diner, drawing murmurs of appreciation from the group. Maggie ladled generous portions into bowls, adding slices of buttered bread and setting everything on the tables. "Dig in, y'all," she said with a grin. "It ain't fancy, but it'll fill you up." The gratitude in their eyes was unmistakable. They ate hungrily, complimenting her cooking and sharing stories between bites. Rachel talked about her daughter back in Ohio, explaining how she drove long hauls to save up for college tuition. Paul joked about the time he accidentally locked himself out of his rig in the middle of nowhere, earning chuckles from the others. Even Joe, who had seemed reserved at first, opened up about his early days as a trucker, recounting hilarious mishaps and lessons learned along the way. Maggie joined them for a while, sitting at the end of one of the booths and listening intently. She asked questions, laughed at their jokes, and offered advice when needed. For a brief moment, the storm outside felt distant, almost forgotten. The diner had transformed into something more than just a pit stop. It had become a sanctuary, a place where bonds were formed and burdens shared. But as the night wore on, the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. The power flickered several times, and the radio crackled with reports of worsening conditions. Roads remained closed, and emergency services were stretched thin. Maggie knew they wouldn't be leaving anytime soon. Determined to keep spirits high, she lit a few candles and brought out a deck of cards. "Who's up for a game?" she asked, her tone cheerful despite the circumstances. The truckers eagerly agreed, gathering around the largest table for a round of poker. Laughter echoed through the diner once again, a reminder that even in the toughest times, joy could still be found. As midnight approached, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Maggie checked on her guests periodically, ensuring everyone was comfortable and warm. She handed out blankets and extra pillows, urging them to rest while they could. Though she tried to hide it, she couldn't shake the worry gnawing at the back of her mind. Supplies were running low, and the thought of being stranded for days weighed heavily on her. Still, she refused to let fear take hold. Instead, she focused on the present, the camaraderie, the laughter, the simple act of being there for one another. As she extinguished the last candle and tucked herself into her own makeshift bed in the corner of the diner, she whispered a silent prayer for safety and strength. Whatever tomorrow held, she knew they would face it together. The night deepened, and the blizzard outside showed no mercy. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling the diner's windows and sending icy drafts through tiny cracks in the walls. Inside, however, the atmosphere remained warm and alive, thanks to Maggie's efforts and the camaraderie of the stranded truckers. Though the power flickered intermittently, casting brief shadows across the room, the group carried on as if nothing could dampen their spirits. Maggie moved between the tables, refilling coffee mugs and checking on her guests. She noticed Rachel, sitting by herself near the counter, staring out at the storm with a distant look in her eyes. Quietly, Maggie approached her and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You okay, hun?" she asked softly. Rachel blinked, pulling herself out of her thoughts. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. After a pause, she added, "I was just thinking about my daughter. She's probably wondering why I haven't called yet." Maggie nodded understandingly. "Phones aren't working too well out here tonight," she said. "But don't you worry. She'll know you're safe once this storm blows over. You're tougher than you think, Rachel." A small smile tugged at the corners of Rachel's mouth. "Thanks, Maggie. I needed to hear that." Meanwhile, Paul and Steve were engaged in a lively debate over whose truck had the better engine. "You can keep your shiny new rigs," Paul said, leaning back in his chair. "Give me something reliable any day of the week," Steve smirked, shaking his head. "Reliable doesn't mean much if it breaks down every 100 miles. Their banter drew laughter from the others, lightening the mood even further. Danny, the youngest of the group, listened intently, soaking up their stories and advice. He admired these seasoned drivers, seeing them as mentors who could teach him the ropes of life on the road. Karen, seated nearby, wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and glanced toward the window. "It's getting worse out there," she remarked, her voice tinged with unease. "How long do you think we'll be stuck?" Maggie joined the conversation, standing behind the counter as she wiped down a mug. "Hard to say," she admitted. "Could be hours, could be days. But don't you worry, we've got plenty of food and blankets to last us until help arrives." Her words reassured the group, but privately, Maggie knew they were stretching their resources thin. She'd already used most of her canned goods and dried ingredients for dinner, and the wood-burning stove was running low on fuel. Still, she refused to let anyone see her concern. Instead, she focused on keeping everyone comfortable and entertained. To pass the time, Angela suggested playing a game of charades. At first, there was some hesitation. After all, they were adults, not kids at a birthday party. But soon enough, the idea caught on. They cleared one of the larger tables and took turns acting out scenarios while the others guessed. Laughter erupted repeatedly, especially when Joe attempted to mime driving a truck without crashing into an imaginary wall. Even Larry, who rarely spoke unless it was about engines or repairs, got involved. His attempt to act out fixing a flat tire had everyone in stitches, particularly when he accidentally knocked over a chair in his enthusiasm. For a while, the storm outside seemed like nothing more than background noise, a distant nuisance, rather than a looming threat. As the hours ticked by, exhaustion began to set in. One by one, the truckers started settling down, finding spots to rest wherever they could. Some stretched out on the booths, using coats as makeshift pillows. Others curled up on the floor, wrapped in blankets Maggie had provided. Danny offered to take the first watch, insisting that someone should stay alert in case the storm worsened or emergency services arrived. Maggie appreciated the gesture, but insisted on staying awake herself. "You've done enough, sweetie," she told him gently. "Go ahead and get some sleep. I'll keep an eye on things." Though reluctant, Danny eventually relented, curling up near the fireplace with a blanket draped over him. Maggie watched. As the room grew quieter, the sound of snores replacing the earlier chatter, she sat by the window gazing out at the relentless snowfall. Her mind wandered, replaying snippets of conversations from earlier in the evening. Each person had shared a piece of themselves, their hopes, fears, and dreams, and Maggie felt honored to have been part of it. Suddenly, a loud bang startled her. It came from the direction of the kitchen, where the old generator sputtered and then went silent. The lights dimmed momentarily before going out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. For a split second, panic gripped Maggie's chest. Then she remembered the candles and matches tucked away in a drawer. Grabbing a flashlight, she hurried to the kitchen and retrieved the supplies. By the time she returned, several of the truckers were stirring, groggy but alert. "What happened?" Karen asked, rubbing her eyes. "The generator gave out," Maggie explained calmly, lighting the candles one by one. "But we'll manage. We've got plenty of firewood for the stove, and these candles will keep us going for now." Paul stood up, stretching his arms. "Need a hand with anything? I can check the generator if you want." Maggie hesitated, unsure whether to accept the offer. She didn't want anyone venturing outside in such dangerous conditions, but Paul seemed determined, and she knew arguing would only waste precious time. "All right," she said finally, "but be careful, and take someone with you. 2 heads are better than 1. Paul nodded and turned to Larry, who was already rummaging through his toolbox. "Come on, buddy. Let's see what we can do." Together, they bundled up and stepped outside, the cold biting at their skin as they made their way to the generator. Inside, Maggie busied herself tidying up the diner, ensuring everything was secure. She checked on the sleeping truckers, adjusting blankets and making sure no one was too cold. When Rachel offered to help clean up, Maggie accepted gratefully, appreciating the extra pair of hands. "You're amazing, you know that?" Rachel said as they worked side by side. "Most people wouldn't go to this much trouble for strangers." Maggie chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Well, you're not really strangers anymore, are you? Besides, it's what anyone would do. Rachel shook her head, unconvinced. No, it's not. Trust me, I've seen both sides of humanity out here. What you're doing, it's special. The compliment caught Maggie off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. Finally, she smiled. Let's just say I've learned that kindness goes a long way, especially in times like these. As they finished cleaning, Paul and Larry returned, stamping snow off their boots and wiping their faces with gloved hands. Bad news, Paul announced. The generator's shot looks like it froze up during the storm. Maggie sighed, though she wasn't entirely surprised. Well, we'll make do. We've got the stove and the candles, that's all we need. Larry held up a small piece of machinery, examining it closely. I might be able to fix it tomorrow once the weather clears. But for tonight, we're on our own. Everyone nodded, accepting the situation with quiet resolve. There was no point in dwelling on setbacks, they were all in this together after all. Maggie handed out hot chocolate, which she'd prepared earlier, and encouraged everyone to settle back down. The warmth of the drink helped ease the tension, and soon the room grew calm once more. By the time Maggie finally sat down herself, the diner was filled with the steady rhythm of breathing and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment. Despite the challenges of the night, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the safety of her guests, for the bonds they'd formed, and for the simple joy of being able to help those in need. Outside, the storm continued to rage, its fury unabated. But inside Maggie's diner there was peace, a fragile yet undeniable warmth that no amount of snow could extinguish. The night wore on, and the blizzard showed no sign of letting up. Inside Maggie's diner, the flickering candlelight cast soft shadows on the walls, creating a cozy, almost dreamlike atmosphere. The group had settled into a quiet rhythm, with most of the truckers sleeping soundly while a few remained awake to keep watch or simply couldn't drift off. Maggie sat by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the snowflakes swirl in chaotic patterns outside. Her thoughts drifted as she stared at the storm. She thought about how unpredictable life could be, how quickly things could change. Just hours ago, these 10 strangers had been battling the elements on a lonely stretch of highway. Now they were huddled together under her roof, sharing laughter, stories, and warmth. It struck her how connected people could become in moments of crisis, how fear and uncertainty could give way to trust and camaraderie if given the chance. Rachel, who had been lying on one of the booths, sat up quietly and noticed Maggie still awake. You should get some rest, Rachel said softly, walking over to join her. You've done so much for all of us tonight. Maggie shook her head with a small smile. I'm fine, she replied. Besides, someone's got to keep an eye on things. Can't have my guests freezing or going hungry, can I? Rachel chuckled, though there was a hint of admiration in her voice. You're something else, you know that? Not many people would take in 10 strangers during a storm like this. It's not about being special, Maggie said after a pause. It's about doing what needs to be done. Out here, we look out for each other. That's just the way it is. Rachel nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. After a moment, she asked, Do you ever feel overwhelmed? Running this place all by yourself, I mean? Maggie sighed, leaning back in her chair. Sometimes, she admitted, there are days when it feels like too much. But then I think about why I started this diner in the first place. It wasn't just to make money. It was to create a space where people could feel safe, even if only for a little while. And nights like this remind me why I keep going. Rachel smiled faintly, her gaze drifting toward the sleeping figures scattered around the room. Well, you've definitely made us feel safe tonight, safe and cared for. Thank you, Maggie. The two women sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the steady hum of breathing and the occasional crackle of the wood-burning stove. Eventually, Rachel excused herself and returned to her makeshift bed, leaving Maggie alone, with her thoughts once more. As the hours passed, the storm outside began to shift. The wind grew louder, whipping against the building with renewed intensity. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the back of the diner, startling everyone awake. Maggie jumped to her feet, her heart racing. "What was that?" Karen asked, clutching her blanket tightly. Maggie grabbed the flashlight and headed toward the noise, followed closely by Paul and Larry. They found the source of the disturbance. A large branch had broken off a nearby tree and crashed onto the roof, causing part of the ceiling to sag slightly. While it didn't appear to pose an immediate danger, it was clear that the structural integrity of the building was compromised. "We need to reinforce this," Larry said, examining the damage. "If another branch hits, it could collapse." Paul nodded in agreement. "Let's see what we can do. We've got tools and materials in our trucks. We'll figure something out." Maggie hesitated, torn between gratitude and concern. "Are you sure? It's freezing out there and the wind's getting worse." "We'll manage," Paul assured her. "Just tell us what you need us to do." With Maggie's guidance, the men retrieved tarps, rope, and wooden planks from their vehicles. Working together, they managed to secure the damaged section of the roof, ensuring it wouldn't cave in under the weight of additional snow. Though the task was physically demanding, the teamwork made it easier. By the time they finished, dawn was beginning to break, painting the horizon with pale streaks of orange and pink. Back inside, the others greeted them with relief and gratitude. Maggie handed out steaming cups of coffee, thanking Paul and Larry profusely for their efforts. "You saved the day," she said, her eyes shining with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Larry shrugged modestly. "Just doing our part. You've done enough for us already." Despite the early hour, no one felt like going back to sleep. Instead, they gathered around the tables, sharing breakfast and discussing their plans for the day ahead. The storm had finally begun to subside, though thick layers of snow still covered the roads. They knew it would take time for the highways to be cleared, but the worst seemed to be over. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the mood in the diner shifted. There was a sense of accomplishment, of having weathered the storm together. Danny, who had been unusually quiet throughout the ordeal, spoke up unexpectedly. "This place is amazing," he said, looking around at the group. "Not just because of the food or the shelter, but because of you, Maggie. You brought us all together." His words caught Maggie off guard, and she blinked back tears. "I didn't do anything special," she insisted. "We all helped each other. That's what matters." Karen chimed in, her voice warm. "Maybe so, but you set the tone. Your kindness inspired the rest of us to step up. And honestly, I think we needed that reminder that even in tough times, we can still come together and support one another." Everyone nodded in agreement, their faces reflecting a mix of pride and gratitude. For a brief moment, the hardships of the past night faded into the background, replaced by a shared sense of triumph. Later that morning, as the group worked together to clean up the diner and prepare for whatever came next, Maggie found herself reflecting on the experience. These 10 individuals who had started the evening as strangers now felt like family. Their resilience, humor, and willingness to help one another had left a lasting impression on her. She also realized something else. The storm hadn't just tested their endurance, it had strengthened their bonds. In the face of adversity, they had discovered the power of community and the importance of looking out for one another. It was a lesson she hoped they would carry with them long after they left her diner. By mid-morning, the roads were still impassable, but the mood remained hopeful. The truckers busied themselves with small tasks, helping Maggie repair minor damages caused by the storm and ensuring the diner was ready for business once the weather improved. They joked and laughed, their earlier exhaustion forgotten in the light of a new day. Maggie watched them with a sense of pride, marveling at how far they'd come in such a short time. What had started as a desperate bid for survival had transformed into something beautiful, a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the connections that could form even in the darkest moments. As the sun climbed higher, its rays piercing, Through the lingering clouds, Maggie stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The world around her was blanketed in pristine white, sparkling like diamonds under the sunlight. Despite the destruction wrought by the storm, there was a strange beauty in the stillness, the promise of renewal and hope. She took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. Together they had weathered the storm, and together they would continue moving forward. The morning sun continued to rise, painting the snowy landscape in shades of gold and silver. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed, quiet, serene, and breathtakingly beautiful. Inside Maggie's diner, the atmosphere was calm, but charged with a sense of anticipation. Everyone knew that while the worst of the blizzard was over, the challenges weren't entirely behind them yet. Roads were still blocked, communication lines remained down, and the group would need to work together to ensure they could move forward safely. Maggie stood by the window, watching as the sunlight reflected off the snow-covered parking lot. Her mind wandered back to the events of the night before. The laughter, the teamwork, and the moments of vulnerability shared among strangers who had become friends. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for what had transpired. But she also couldn't help thinking about the future. Would this bond last beyond today? Or would it fade once everyone went their separate ways? Her thoughts were interrupted when Rachel approached her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Here," Rachel said, handing one to Maggie. "You look like you could use this." Maggie accepted the cup with a smile. "Thanks, hun. You're right. I didn't realize how tired I was until now." Rachel leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee slowly. "I've been thinking. None of us would have made it through last night without you. You didn't just give us food and shelter. You gave us hope. That's something we won't forget." Maggie shook her head, brushing off the compliment. "It wasn't just me. We all pitched in. Paul and Larry fixed the roof. Karen kept spirits high. Danny helped clean up. It was a team effort." "Maybe," Rachel admitted, "but you were the glue holding everything together. You reminded us that even when things seem impossible, there's always a way to push through if we stick together." Maggie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gazed out the window again, lost in thought. Rachel's words resonated deeply with her. They echoed the reasons she had opened the diner in the first place. It wasn't just about serving meals. It was about creating a space where people could find comfort and connection, even in the toughest times. Outside, Steve and Brian were inspecting the trucks, making sure they were still in working order after being buried under snow overnight. They dug out windshields, checked engines, and cleared exhaust pipes. Though the vehicles appeared mostly unscathed, they knew it would take more than just clearing the snow to get moving again. The roads leading away from the diner were completely impassable, buried under layers of ice and drifts several feet high. "We're going to need some serious help to get out of here," Steve muttered, kicking at a mound of snow with his boot. "Plows probably won't reach us for hours, maybe even days." Brian nodded grimly. "Yeah, but sitting around won't do us any good either. Let's see if we can clear a path ourselves, at least enough to signal for help if someone drives by." With that, they gathered shovels and began working alongside Joe and Larry, who had joined them outside. The 4 men labored tirelessly, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they hacked away at the frozen ground. It was slow, grueling work, but they refused to give up. Every swing of the shovel brought them closer to freedom and to ensuring the safety of everyone inside the diner. Back inside, Angela and Karen decided to tackle another issue: supplies. While Maggie had managed to stretch her pantry throughout the night, it was clear that resources were running dangerously low. Angela suggested taking inventory of what each trucker had brought with them, pooling whatever non-perishable items they could spare. "Let's see what we've got," Angela said, pulling out a notebook and pen. "Canned goods, snacks, bottled water, anything that'll keep us going until help arrives." Karen nodded enthusiastically, turning to the others. "Hey folks, if you've got anything stashed in your rigs, now's the time to share. We're all in this together." To their relief, the group responded generously. Paul handed over a box of energy bars while Rachel contributed a bag of dried fruit. Danny rummaged through his truck and found an unopened package of granola. Even Joe, who initially seemed reluctant to part with his stash, eventually offered up a few cans of soup. By the time they finished collecting, the pile of donated items was impressive. Maggie watched with pride as Angela organized everything neatly on the counter. "Looks like we've got enough to last a few more days," Angela announced. "And if anyone else shows up, we'll be ready for them too." The generosity of the group touched Maggie deeply. She realized that these simple acts of kindness, the sharing of food, the willingness to lend a hand, were proof of the bonds they had formed. These weren't just random travelers anymore. They were a community, united by shared experiences and mutual support. As midday approached, the sound of distant engines broke the silence. At first, no one was sure what it meant. Was it a passing vehicle or perhaps rescue crews finally arriving? Curiosity turned to excitement when a convoy of trucks appeared on the horizon, their headlights cutting through the bright winter sunlight. Slowly, they pulled into the parking lot, stopping near the stranded vehicles. Paul stepped outside, shielding his eyes against the glare. "What's going on?" he asked aloud, confused by the sudden arrival. One of the drivers hopped out of his rig and walked over, extending a gloved hand. "Heard about what happened last night," the man said, introducing himself as Greg. "Word spread fast among the truckers stuck nearby. Figured we'd come check on you folks, and maybe lend a hand." Maggie emerged from the diner, her expression one of disbelief and gratitude. "You came all the way out here for us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Greg grinned. "Of course, stories like yours don't happen every day. Besides, we owe you. Without your diner, those 10 might not have made it through the storm." The newly arrived convoy quickly sprang into action. Some drivers brought plows attached to their rigs, using them to clear paths through the snow. Others unpacked tools and equipment to assist with repairs. Within hours, the parking lot looked almost normal again, and the road leading away from the diner was beginning to take shape. Inside, the original group of truckers worked alongside, the newcomers preparing food and drinks to thank them for their efforts. Maggie bustled around the kitchen, directing traffic and ensuring everyone was fed. Despite the chaos, there was a palpable sense of joy in the air, a celebration of resilience and solidarity. By late afternoon, the roads were finally clear enough for travel. As the convoy prepared to leave, Greg approached Maggie, holding out a small envelope. "This is from all of us," he said simply. "A token of our appreciation." Maggie hesitated before accepting it, unsure of what to say. When she opened the envelope later, she found cash donations totaling far more than she had expected. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of their generosity. This wasn't just repayment. It was a testament to the impact her actions had made. As the last of the trucks disappeared down the highway, the diner fell silent once more. The group gathered around the table, reflecting on everything that had happened. Though they were eager to continue their journeys, none of them wanted to leave without expressing their gratitude. "You've changed our lives, Maggie," Rachel said earnestly. "We'll never forget what you did for us." Maggie smiled, blinking back tears. "I didn't do anything special. All I did was open my door and offer a little kindness. You're the ones who made this place feel like home." The truckers nodded, each voicing their thanks before heading to their rigs. One by one, they drove off, waving goodbye as they disappeared into the distance. Maggie stood on the porch watching until the last taillight vanished. Though the diner was quiet once again, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. In the span of 24 hours, she had witnessed the best of humanity: compassion, resilience, and unity in the face of adversity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, Maggie returned inside. The diner was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. Instead, it felt alive with memories of laughter, teamwork, and hope. Whatever the future held, she knew one thing for certain: kindness had the power to change lives, and sometimes even the smallest gestures could create ripples that reached farther than anyone imagined. The days that followed the blizzard passed quickly, but the memory of that stormy night lingered in Maggie's mind like a warm ember. She found herself replaying the events over and over: the laughter, the teamwork, the quiet moments of connection. Though life at the diner returned to its usual rhythm, something had shifted. Maggie felt a renewed sense of purpose, as if the storm had not only tested her resilience, but also reminded her why she loved running this little place on the edge of nowhere. Word about what had happened spread faster than Maggie could have imagined. Truckers passing through began stopping by just to meet her, sharing stories they'd heard from others who had been there that night. Some brought gifts, boxes of supplies, fresh produce, or even small donations to help restock the pantry. Others simply wanted to shake her hand and thank her for setting an example of kindness in a world that often felt cold and disconnected. Maggie accepted their gratitude humbly, always deflecting praise with a smile. "It wasn't me," she would say. "We all helped each other. That's what matters." Despite her modesty, the impact of her actions was undeniable. The diner became more than just a stop along the highway. It became a symbol of hope and community. People started referring to it as the heart of Wyoming, a place where anyone could find warmth, no matter how harsh the weather outside. One crisp morning, a few weeks after the storm, Maggie received an unexpected visitor. A man named Charlie, who introduced himself as a retired trucker, walked into the diner carrying a large cardboard box. His weathered face lit up when he saw Maggie behind the counter. "You're Maggie Carter, aren't you?" he asked, his voice filled with admiration. "That's me," Maggie replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I do for you, Charlie?" Charlie set the box down gently and opened it, revealing stacks of handmade blankets and scarves. "These are for you," he said. "My wife and I heard about what you did during the blizzard. We figured you might need some extra supplies for the next time something like that happens." Maggie's eyes widened in surprise. "Charlie, this is incredible, but you didn't have to—" "Yes, we did," Charlie interrupted firmly. "People like you remind us that there's still good in the world. We wanted to give back, even if it's just a little bit." Touched by his generosity, Maggie thanked him profusely before inviting him to stay for coffee and pie. As they sat together, chatting about life on the road and the importance of helping others, Maggie realized how much these connections meant to her. Each person who came through her door carried a story, and every interaction added another thread to the tapestry of her life. Inspired by the outpouring of support, Maggie decided to take things a step further. She had always dreamed of doing more for the truckers and travelers who relied on her diner, and now she finally had the means and the motivation to make it happen. With the donations she'd received, she launched a new initiative called Highway Hearts. The program aimed to provide emergency kits for stranded drivers, discounted meals for those struggling financially, and temporary housing during severe weather events. Maggie reached out to local businesses and organizations, asking for their help in spreading the word and gathering resources. To her delight, the response was overwhelming. Grocery stores donated, food hardware shops contributed tools and supplies, and even nearby families offered spare rooms in their homes for emergencies. Within weeks, Highway Hearts had grown into a network of support that stretched far beyond the diner itself. Paul, Rachel, and several of the other truckers who had been stranded during the blizzard stayed in touch, checking in regularly to see how things were going. They often stopped by whenever their routes brought them close to Wyoming, bringing updates on their lives and sharing news of how Maggie's kindness had inspired them to pay it forward. Rachel, in particular, became deeply involved in Maggie's efforts. On one visit, she shared how she had started volunteering at a shelter in Ohio, teaching job skills to single mothers. "You showed me that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference," she told Maggie. "I wanted to carry that spirit forward." Maggie listened with pride, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Her decision to open her doors that snowy night hadn't just saved 10 lives. It had sparked a chain reaction of goodwill that continued to ripple outward. Months turned into years, and Maggie's diner remained a cornerstone of the community. Travelers passing through often left notes on the wall, sharing their stories and expressing gratitude for the warmth they had found there. Some wrote about how Maggie's hospitality had brightened their darkest days. Others described how the kindness they experienced at the diner had inspired them to be better versions of themselves. On quiet evenings, Maggie would sit by the window, reading these notes and reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the challenges she had faced when she first arrived in Wyoming, how lonely and uncertain everything had seemed back then. Now, surrounded by friends and strangers alike, she knew she had found her true home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the plains, Maggie stepped outside to watch the stars appear. The air was cool and crisp, and the distant hum of trucks on the highway provided a comforting backdrop. She thought about all the people whose lives had intersected with hers because of this tiny diner, a place she had once considered nothing more than a business venture. Her thoughts drifted to Paul, Rachel, and the others who had been stranded during the blizzard. Though they rarely visited anymore due to busy schedules, they kept in touch through letters and phone calls. Each message reminded her of the bond they had formed and the lasting impact of their shared experience. As she stood there gazing up at the vast Wyoming sky, Maggie felt a profound sense of peace. Life wasn't always easy, and storms, both literal and metaphorical, would inevitably come. But she had learned that resilience wasn't about facing challenges alone. It was about leaning on one another, finding strength in unity, and choosing kindness even when it seemed impossible. The diner's neon sign flickered softly behind her, its glowing words a beacon of hope against the darkening landscape. Maggie smiled, knowing that her little corner of the world would continue to shine brightly, welcoming travelers and offering solace to those in need. And so, Maggie Carter carried on, her heart full of gratitude and her spirit unshaken. Through every storm and every calm, she remained steadfast in her belief that even in the most isolated places, human connection could light the way.